A millionaire gave a homeless mother and her baby shelter for the night. What he found in the morning left him speechless. And before we continue, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories like this. Enjoy the story. The rain was a relentless downpour, turning the city's streets into rivers of chaos. The wipers on the Bentley swayed rhythmically, fighting an uphill battle against the sheets of water cascading down the windshield. Inside the car, James Everett sat in silence, the faint hum of the engine a background noise to his turbulent thoughts. His dark eyes were fixed on the storm outside, but his mind was elsewhere, somewhere far removed from the polished leather seats and the air of luxury that surrounded him. James wasn't a man easily shaken. Years of navigating high-stakes business deals had taught him to maintain a cool demeanor, even in the most challenging circumstances. But tonight, there was an unease he couldn't shake. Maybe it was the storm or the emptiness of his sprawling mansion waiting for him. Either way, the silence felt heavier than usual. "Take the long way home, Robert," James instructed his chauffeur, his voice cutting through the quiet. Robert glanced at him through the rear-view mirror, hesitating only briefly. "Yes, sir." The Bentley glided through the rain-soaked streets, its powerful engine unfazed by the weather. James leaned back in his seat, loosening his tie. The city outside was almost unrecognizable, its usual hustle muffled by the storm. Street lights flickered, casting fleeting shadows on the pavement. Pedestrians were scarce, and those who braved the weather hurried along with umbrellas or huddled under awnings. As they rounded a corner, something unusual caught Robert's eye. "Sir," he said cautiously, "there's someone up ahead." James sat forward, his attention snapping to the figure illuminated by the headlights. A woman stood under a dim, flickering street lamp, her silhouette hunched against the rain. She was clutching a bundle tightly to her chest, shielding it from the storm with her own body. For a moment, James thought she might be waiting for a bus or a cab, but as they drew closer, it became clear that she wasn't waiting at all. She was simply surviving. "Stop the car," James said abruptly. "Sir, it's not safe." "Stop," James repeated firmly. The Bentley came to a smooth halt a few feet away from the woman. Before Robert could protest further, James opened the door and stepped out into the storm. The rain was icy, drenching him instantly, but he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the woman, who turned sharply at the sound of the car door. She was young, though the exhaustion etched into her features made her seem older. Her hair clung to her face, soaked and plastered against her pale skin. Her thin coat was no match for the cold, and her shoes, barely more than worn-out sneakers, squelched in the puddles beneath her. But was the bundle in her arms that held James's attention. A baby, swaddled in a tattered blanket, its tiny cries muffled by the storm. "Ma'am," James said, his voice steady despite the rain. "What are you doing out here?" The woman stepped back, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm fine," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "I don't need help. You're soaking wet, and it's freezing," James replied, taking a step closer. "You and the baby can't stay out here. Let me help." Her grip on the baby tightened. "I don't need charity," she said defensively. James held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "This isn't charity. It's common sense. You're not safe out here. Please, get in the car." The woman hesitated, her eyes darting between James and the Bentley. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the baby whimpered softly in her arms. Finally, she nodded, her pride yielding to desperation. Inside the warmth of the Bentley, the woman sat stiffly, her arms wrapped protectively around the baby. James removed his soaked jacket and draped it over the back of the seat, ignoring the water pooling beneath his shoes. He offered her a towel from the glove compartment, but she refused, her eyes fixed on the floor. "What's your name?" James asked after a moment. "Clara," she said quietly. "And this is Samuel." James nodded, filing the names away. "How old is he?" 3 months, she replied, her voice barely audible. James studied her for a moment. She looked exhausted, her face pale and drawn. Her clothes were threadbare, and her hands trembled slightly. Whether from the cold or hunger, he couldn't tell. The car pulled through the gates of his estate, the headlights illuminating the sprawling mansion that loomed ahead. Clara's eyes widened as she took in the sheer size of the property. The manicured lawns, the marble columns, the grand windows glowing warmly against the storm. It was a world far removed from her reality. "This is your house?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. "Yes," James said simply. "And it's where you'll be staying tonight." Clara opened her mouth to protest, but James cut her off. "You need a safe place to sleep. That's all. No strings attached." As they entered the mansion, the butler, Arthur, appeared in the grand foyer, his expression stoic, but his eyes flickering with curiosity. He raised an eyebrow at the sight of Clara and the baby, but said nothing. "Prepare the guest room," James instructed, "and make sure it's stocked with warm blankets and clothes." Arthur nodded, disappearing down the hallway. Clara stood awkwardly in the entryway, dripping water onto the marble floor. The grandeur of the mansion seemed to swallow her whole, its high ceilings and ornate furnishings an overwhelming contrast to the storm she had just escaped. "This way," James said, leading her up the grand staircase. The guest room was warm and inviting, with a large bed covered in soft linens and a crib tucked into the corner. Clara placed Samuel down gently, her hands lingering on him as though afraid he might vanish. James watched from the doorway, unsure of what to say. "You'll be safe here," he said finally. "We'll figure everything out in the morning." Clara turned to him, her eyes wary. "Why are you doing this?" James hesitated, then replied simply, "Because I can." It wasn't the answer she expected, but it was enough for now. With a quiet "thank you," she closed the door, leaving James standing alone in the hallway. He lingered for a moment, staring at the closed door as if it held answers to questions he hadn't yet asked. As he made his way to his room, James couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an act of kindness. Something about Clara and Samuel felt different, like a thread from a tapestry he thought had unraveled long ago. And as the storm continued to rage outside, James knew one thing for certain: this encounter would change everything. The morning sun crept through the heavy drapes of the guest room, casting soft beams of light on the walls. Clara stirred awake, her body tense from years of sleeping on hard surfaces. For a fleeting moment, she thought she was dreaming. The bed beneath her was too soft, the room too warm, and the quiet too comforting to be real. But the faint coos of Samuel brought her back to reality. Clara sat up slowly, glancing around. The room was pristine, with elegant furnishings that spoke of wealth she couldn't fathom. A crib sat near the window, where Samuel lay, kicking his tiny legs. She rose, her bare feet sinking into the plush carpet, and scooped him up. His small face lit up at the sight of her, and she kissed his forehead, savoring the warmth of his tiny body. "Good morning, my little one," she whispered, her voice soft but tinged with exhaustion. Downstairs, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and warm toast filled the air. James Everett sat at the head of the long dining table, a newspaper folded neatly beside his untouched plate. The morning was peaceful, but his thoughts were anything but. He couldn't shake the image of Clara and Samuel from his mind, their vulnerability, their unspoken story. "Arthur," James called, his voice echoing in the large dining room. The butler appeared almost immediately, his expression calm and composed as always. "Yes, sir. Has our guest come downstairs yet?" "Not yet, sir," Arthur replied, carefully pouring coffee into James's cup. "Shall I inform her breakfast is ready?" James hesitated before shaking his head. "No. Let her take her time. She's been through enough. Arthur nodded, his face betraying only the slightest hint of curiosity. Very well, sir. Meanwhile, Clara stood by the window in the guest room, holding Samuel close as she tried to process her situation. The events of the previous night felt surreal, like a fragment of someone else's life. She glanced at the elegant robe draped over the chair, a gift left for her by the butler, and sighed. Every part of her wanted to run, to escape before she became entangled in whatever kindness James Everett was offering. But Samuel stirred in her arms, his small fingers clutching her hair, and she knew she couldn't leave. Not yet. When she finally ventured downstairs, she was struck by the grandeur of the mansion in the daylight. The intricate woodwork, the sparkling chandeliers, the paintings adorning the walls. It was overwhelming. Clara felt like an imposter in a world she didn't belong to. James looked up as she entered the dining room, his expression unreadable. "Good morning," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. "I hope you slept well." Clara nodded, her grip on Samuel tightening. "Thank you," she said quietly. Arthur appeared, placing a plate of eggs, toast, and fruit in front of her. Clara hesitated, her stomach growling despite her reluctance to accept more generosity. She glanced at Samuel, who stared at the food with wide, curious eyes, and finally picked up the fork. James watched her eat in silence, noting the way she moved with caution, as if expecting the world to take everything away at any moment. When she finished the first bite, her shoulders relaxed slightly, and she fed Samuel a small piece of fruit, smiling at his delighted reaction. After a while, James broke the silence. "Clara, I know you've been through a lot, but I need to understand your situation if I'm going to help." Clara tensed, her gaze dropping to the table. "There's nothing to understand," she said. "I'm just trying to survive." "And Samuel's father?" James asked gently. Her jaw tightened, and she looked away. "He's not in the picture," she replied flatly. James nodded, deciding not to press further. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, ornate locket. "Arthur found this in the guest room. I assume it's yours." Clara's eyes widened as she reached for the locket, but James opened it before handing over. Inside was a photograph, faded but clear enough to make out the faces of a young man and woman smiling warmly at the camera. James stared at the man's face, his breath catching. He recognized him. "This man," James began, his voice low. "Who is he?" Clara froze, her fingers trembling. "That's my father," she whispered. "Why?" James's mind raced. The man in the photograph wasn't just familiar. He was someone from his past, someone who had shaped the man he had become, for better or worse. Memories of late-night business meetings, heated arguments, and a betrayal that left deep scars came flooding back. "Your father," James said slowly, "was David Langston." Clara's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "You knew him?" James nodded, his expression dark. "I did. We worked together years ago." "And what happened?" Clara demanded, her voice rising. "Why did he end up with nothing?" James hesitated, the weight of guilt settling over him like a heavy cloak. "It's complicated," he said finally. "But I owe him a debt I can never repay." Clara's grip on the locket tightened. "You owe him," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "He died penniless. He worked himself to death, trying to give me a life he could never afford." James looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I made mistakes," he admitted. "Mistakes that cost him everything. And I've regretted them every day since." Clara stood abruptly, Samuel cradled protectively in her arms. "You think regret is enough," she said, her voice sharp. "It doesn't bring him back. It doesn't change what happened to me or Samuel." James didn't respond. He couldn't. The truth of her words cut deeper than he was prepared for. As Clara turned to leave the room, he called out to her. "Wait." She stopped but didn't turn around. "Please," James said, his voice softer now. "Stay. Let me help you." Not out of guilt, but because it's the right thing to do. Clara hesitated, her back still turned. Finally, she said, "I'll stay for Samuel's sake. But don't think for a second that I trust you." And with that, she walked out of the room, leaving James alone with his thoughts, and the ghosts of a past he could no longer ignore. The mansion was eerily quiet that afternoon, the kind of silence that felt heavier than usual. Clara sat in the guest room, her mind racing as Samuel slept peacefully in the crib. She held the locket tightly in her hand, running her thumb over the faded photograph of her parents. The revelations of the morning had left her shaken. Her father, David Langston, wasn't just a name in James Everett's memory. He was a ghost haunting the corridors of this opulent home. Clara's thoughts spiraled. What had James meant by mistakes? What could a man of his wealth and power possibly owe to her father, a man who had died in obscurity and poverty? The questions gnawed at her, and no matter how much she tried to push them aside, they refused to be silenced. Finally, she made a decision. She needed answers. Quietly, she left the room and made her way down the grand staircase. The house seemed even larger in the daylight, its intricate details more pronounced: the crystal chandeliers, the ornate railings, the marble floors. Everything about this place screamed wealth, yet it felt strangely empty. Clara found James in the library, seated in a high-backed leather chair. A fire crackled softly in the fireplace, casting flickering shadows across the shelves lined with books. James sat with a glass of amber liquid in his hand, staring into the flames as though searching for something he couldn't quite reach. "Mr. Everett," Clara said, her voice cutting through the quiet. James turned his head, surprised but not startled. He set the glass down on a side table and gestured to the chair across from him. "Clara," he said, his tone even, "please sit." She hesitated, then took the seat. For a moment, they sat in silence, the only sound the occasional pop from the fire. Finally, Clara spoke. "You knew my father." James nodded. "I did. What happened between you two?" she asked, her voice firm. "I need to know the truth." James leaned back, his gaze distant. "Your father and I met when we were both much younger. I was an ambitious entrepreneur, and David was the man who believed in me when no one else did. He had vision, drive, and a moral compass that I often lacked. Together, we built something extraordinary, a business that could have changed lives. So, what went wrong?" Clara pressed. James exhaled deeply, his hands resting on the armrests of the chair. "Greed, ambition, ego. Take your pick." He paused, his jaw tightening. "We had a deal, a major project that could have set us both up for life. But the people we partnered with, they weren't as ethical as David. He wanted to walk away, to protect our reputation and the integrity of the business. I didn't listen. I saw dollar signs and opportunity. And my father?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "He tried to stop me," James admitted. "He warned me about the risks, about what could happen if we aligned ourselves with the wrong people. But I didn't care. I went ahead with the deal anyway." Clara's fists clenched. "And what happened?" "The deal fell apart," James said, his voice heavy with regret. "The partners we trusted betrayed us. The fallout destroyed everything we'd built. I was able to recover, to rebuild my empire. But David, he wasn't so lucky. He lost everything, his savings, his reputation. And I let it happen." Clara's eyes burned with unshed tears. "You let my father take the fall for your mistakes." James didn't flinch under her glare. "I didn't know the full extent of the damage until it was too late. By the time I tried to reach out, he was gone. He disappeared from my life, and I didn't look hard enough." "You didn't look at all," Clara snapped. "You just move on, didn't you? With your wealth, your mansion, your perfect life." James leaned forward, his expression earnest. "You're right. I moved on. But I never forgot, Clara. Not a single day has gone by where I haven't thought about what I did, what I failed to do. That's why, when I saw you last night, I couldn't turn away. You and Samuel. You're my chance to make things right." Clara shook her head, her emotions swirling in a storm of anger and confusion. "You think helping me now will erase what happened to my father? You think throwing money at us will fix everything?" "No," James said firmly. "I know it won't, but I have to try. Not for me, but for you. And for Samuel." Clara looked down at the locket in her hand, the faces of her parents staring back at her. "My father gave up everything for me," she whispered. "He sacrificed his pride, his dreams, his life. All so I could have a chance. And now it's my turn to give you that chance," James said softly. The room fell silent once more. Clara's mind raced, torn between distrust and the faintest glimmer of hope. She wanted to walk away, to leave this man and his guilt behind. But Samuel stirred in her arms, reminding her of the tiny life she was responsible for, a life that deserved more than she could currently provide. "I'll stay," Clara said finally, her voice steady. "But not for you, for Samuel." James nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "That's all I ask." As Clara rose to leave, she paused in the doorway, her gaze lingering on James. "You have a lot to prove, Mr. Everett." "I know," James replied, "and I will." Clara left the library, her steps echoing down the hall. James sat back in his chair, staring into the fire once more. For the first time in years, he felt a faint spark of something he hadn't known he was missing: redemption. But he also knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. The following morning, the mansion buzzed with subdued energy. Arthur and the staff moved efficiently, preparing breakfast and ensuring the house was immaculate. Yet there was a quiet tension lingering in the air. Clara, holding Samuel in her arms, descended the grand staircase slowly, her eyes scanning the intricate details of the home. The overwhelming luxury seemed to grow larger each day, a stark reminder of the chasm between her life and James Everett's world. She entered the dining room cautiously, her steps hesitant as if crossing an invisible threshold. James was already seated at the head of the long table, reading a newspaper. The smell of fresh coffee and warm pastries wafted through the air, but Clara's stomach was too knotted to feel hungry. "Good morning," James said, glancing up from the paper. His tone was calm, but carried a subtle weight, as though he were preparing for an important conversation. "Morning," Clara replied curtly, adjusting Samuel on her hip. She wasn't sure why she had come down. Perhaps she wanted answers, or maybe it was the pull of obligation after accepting James's offer to stay. Arthur appeared silently, pulling out a chair for her. "Please sit," James gestured, his voice measured. Clara hesitated, then lowered herself into the chair, carefully balancing Samuel on her lap. Arthur placed a plate of food before her: scrambled eggs, toast, and fresh fruit. Clara glanced at it, her mind conflicted. She wasn't used to accepting help, let alone luxuries like this. Samuel reached for a piece of toast, babbling softly, and Clara smiled despite herself. She tore off a small piece and fed it to him, her defenses momentarily slipping. James watched the interaction, a faint, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You're good with him," James said after a moment, breaking the silence. Clara glanced up, startled. "He's my son," she replied simply. "I don't have a choice." James nodded, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. "Clara, I've been thinking about you, about Samuel, and about how I can help." Her expression hardened instantly. "Help? You mean charity?" "No," James replied firmly. "I mean a real opportunity. Something that can give you and Samuel a future. Clara's eyes narrowed. And what exactly does that mean? James leaned forward slightly, his tone sincere. It means I want to do more than just offer you a roof over your head. I want to give you the tools to build a stable life, a career, an education for Samuel, whatever you need to stand on your own 2 feet. Clara's grip on Samuel tightened. Why would you do that? Out of guilt. James didn't flinch at her bluntness. Partly, yes. I won't lie to you, Clara. I carry a lot of guilt for what happened to your father. But more than that, I see potential in you. You're strong, resilient. You've survived so much on your own. Imagine what you could do with real support. Clara looked down at Samuel, her mind racing. The offer was tempting, almost too good to be true. But years of hardship had taught her to be wary of kindness, especially from men like James. Men with power and privilege who always seemed to have an angle. "What do you want in return?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Nothing," James replied, his gaze steady. "This isn't a transaction. It's a chance for me to make amends, to honor your father's memory, and to help you build the life you deserve." Clara studied him, searching for any sign of deception. But James's expression was calm, his sincerity unwavering. Still, she wasn't ready to let her guard down completely. "You expect me to believe this is purely out of the goodness of your heart?" Clara said, her tone skeptical. "I expect you to be cautious," James admitted. "You'd be a fool not to be. But I also hope you'll see that I mean what I say." Arthur returned, placing an envelope on the table in front of James. Without a word, James slid it toward Clara. She eyed it warily before picking up and opening it. Her breath caught as she pulled out a check. The amount written was staggering, far more money than she had ever seen in her life. "This is too much," Clara said, her voice shaking. "I can't accept this." "It's not a handout," James said firmly. "It's a start. Use it however you see fit. Pay off debts, find childcare, take classes. It's up to you." Clara shook her head, overwhelmed. "I don't know if I can trust you." "Then don't," James said simply. "Not yet. But take this first step, and let me prove that I'm serious." The room fell silent, the weight of James's words hanging in the air. Clara looked down at Samuel, who had fallen asleep in her arms, his tiny face peaceful. She thought about the sleepless nights, the days spent wondering how she would feed him, the constant fear of losing everything. And now, here was a man offering her a lifeline, one that came with no strings, at least not yet. "I'll think about it," Clara said finally, her voice low. James nodded, his expression understanding. "That's all I ask." Clara rose from the table, cradling Samuel carefully. As she turned to leave, she paused at the doorway, glancing back at James. "If I accept this, it's for Samuel, not for you. I wouldn't have it any other way," James replied. Clara left the dining room, her mind a whirlwind of doubt and hope. She didn't want to trust James, didn't want to rely on anyone but herself. But for Samuel's sake, she was willing to take the risk. James remained at the table long after she was gone, staring at the fire crackling in the hearth. He had taken the first step toward making amends, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. Clara's trust wasn't something he could buy. It was something he would have to earn, one action at a time. As the flames danced, James felt a flicker of determination. For the first time in years, he had a purpose beyond wealth and success, and he wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers. The days passed slowly, each one blending into the next. Clara had accepted James's offer cautiously, but her walls were far from crumbling. She spent most of her time with Samuel, caring for him in the spacious guest room or walking with him in the sprawling gardens. The mansion, with its opulent beauty, felt more like a gilded cage than a sanctuary. James, on the other hand, kept himself busy with work. Meetings, calls, and endless paperwork filled his days, yet his mind often wandered back to Clara and Samuel. He watched them from afar, unsure how to bridge the growing chasm of mistrust between them. The locket she carried haunted him, a constant reminder of David Langston and the secrets they both seemed to be avoiding. One afternoon, as Samuel napped, Clara found herself wandering through the house. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, but curiosity tugged at her. The grand halls, lined with paintings and photographs, felt like a gallery of James's life, a life far removed from her own. She stopped in front of a large portrait of a younger James, standing beside a man she instantly recognized from her locket. Her father. Clara stared at the image, her heart pounding. Her father looked so different, confident, proud, and full of hope. The sight stirred a mix of emotions, longing, sadness, and a deep, unresolved anger. Finding the past, are we? A voice said behind her, startling her. Clara turned to see Arthur, James's butler, standing a few steps away. His expression was neutral, but there was a knowing glint in his eyes. "I didn't mean to pry," Clara said quickly, stepping away from the portrait. "You're not prying," Arthur replied. "This house holds many stories, Miss Langston. Some of them are worth revisiting." Clara hesitated, then asked, "What do you know about my father?" Arthur's brow furrowed slightly. "I know he was a good man, one who believed in integrity and hard work. He was the reason Mr. Everett became the man he is today." Clara folded her arms, her voice tinged with bitterness. "And yet, my father died with nothing, while Mr. Everett lives in all of this." Arthur tilted his head thoughtfully. "James Everett carries more guilt than he shows, Miss Langston. But guilt doesn't undo the past. Only actions can." Before Clara could respond, Arthur gestured toward the library. "If you're looking for answers, perhaps you should start there. Mr. Everett keeps records of everything." Clara's curiosity flared. She thanked Arthur and made her way to the library, her heart racing with a mix of anticipation and dread. The library was vast, with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with books and documents. Clara approached the large desk in the center of the room, where stacks of papers sat neatly arranged. She hesitated, then began sifting through them, her hands trembling slightly. It didn't take long for her to find something that stopped her cold. Tucked beneath a ledger was a folder labeled Langston Enterprises. Clara opened it, revealing a collection of contracts, letters, and meeting notes. She recognized her father's handwriting immediately, bold and confident, just as she remembered. One document stood out, a letter addressed to James. It was dated just a few weeks before her father's downfall. Clara's hands shook as she read. "Dear James, I don't know if this letter will reach you, but I feel I have no choice but to write. The deal we're working on, it's not what it seems. I've uncovered evidence of fraud, and I believe our partners are using us as a front for something far more dangerous. I want to pull out, but I know you don't agree. Please, James, listen to me. If we move forward, we'll lose everything. I can't risk that, not for myself and not for my daughter. David Langston." Clara's breath caught in her throat. The words painted a picture of a man desperately trying to do the right thing, even as the odds were stacked against him. She folded the letter carefully and continued searching the folder, her emotions a whirlwind of anger and heartbreak. She found more evidence, documents that supported her father's claims, notes detailing his suspicions, and even a photograph of him with the men he had warned James about. The pieces began to fit together, forming a story that was both tragic and infuriating. Just as Clara was about to close the folder, another letter slipped out. This one was different, written in James's handwriting. "David, I received your letter. I've gone over the documents you sent, and I can't deny what you've uncovered. But pulling out of this deal will ruin us both. You're asking me to risk everything for a hunch. I'm sorry, but I can't do that. We've come too far to back out now. James." Clara stared at the letter, her vision blurring with tears. Her father had tried to warn James, and James had ignored him. The betrayal cut deep, not just for what it had cost her father, but for what it had cost her as well. "Found what you were looking for?" James's voice came from the doorway, startling her. Clara spun around, clutching the folder to her chest. "How long have you been standing there?" "Long enough," James said, stepping into the room. His face was calm, but there was a tension in his eyes that betrayed his composure. "You've been looking for answers, haven't you?" Clara held up the folder. "I found them. My father tried to warn you, and you didn't listen. You let him fall while you built your empire." James's jaw tightened. "I made mistakes, Clara. I've admitted that, but it's not as simple as you think." "Then explain it to me," Clara said, her voice trembling with anger. "Explain how you justified ruining his life." James stepped closer, his expression pained. "At the time, I thought I was doing what was best for the business. I didn't see the full picture until it was too late. By the time I realized the extent of the damage, your father had already lost everything." Clara's voice rose. "And you did nothing to help him?" "I tried," James said, his voice breaking slightly. "But David, he wouldn't let me. He was proud, Clara. Too proud to take anything from me after what happened." Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You could have tried harder. You could have done more." James took a deep breath. "You're right. I could have. And I've regretted it every day since." The room fell silent, the weight of their shared pain hanging heavy in the air. Clara looked down at the folder in her hands, the evidence of her father's struggles and James's failure. She didn't know what to do with the anger and sadness swirling inside her. Finally, she spoke. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you." "I don't expect you to," James replied softly. "But I hope, in time, you'll let me prove that I can be better." Clara didn't respond. She turned and left the library, the folder clutched tightly to her chest. James watched her go, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the past couldn't be undone. But as he stared at the empty doorway, he resolved to do whatever it took to earn her trust, and maybe, one day, her forgiveness. The morning after Clara's discovery in the library, a thick tension hung over the mansion. Clara avoided James, retreating to her room with Samuel, while James buried himself in work, using spreadsheets and phone calls as a distraction from the guilt gnawing at his conscience. For Clara, the folder she'd found had become a lifeline to understanding her father's truth. She spread the documents across the bed, reading and rereading each one as Samuel played nearby. Every detail painted a clearer picture of the man she had lost and the betrayal that had sealed his fate. But there was still one thing that didn't make sense. Why had her father partnered with those men in the first place? Later that day, as the mansion settled into its usual rhythm, Arthur appeared at Clara's door. His knock was soft but firm, and when she opened it, his face was calm yet serious. "Miss Langston," he said, "Mr. Everett would like to see you in the study." Clara's first instinct was to refuse, but curiosity got the better of her. She nodded, scooping up Samuel and following Arthur through the long hallways. When they reached the study, Arthur opened the door and gestured for her to enter. James was seated behind a massive mahogany desk, his fingers steepled in front of him. He looked up as Clara stepped inside, his gaze flickering to Samuel before settling on her. "Thank you for coming," James began, his tone careful. "There's something I need to show you." Clara raised an eyebrow, her arms tightening around Samuel. "What now? Another excuse? Another attempt to justify what you did?" "No," James said, standing and moving to a nearby cabinet. "This isn't about justifying anything. It's about giving you the full truth." He unlocked the cabinet and retrieved a small leather-bound notebook. Its edges were worn, the cover scuffed from years of handling. He held it out to her. "This belonged to your father," James said. "He left it with me before everything fell apart. I think it's time you read it." Clara hesitated, her eyes darting between James and the notebook. Finally, she took it, the leather cool against her fingers. She opened it to the first page, where her father's bold handwriting stared back at her. To my daughter, Clara, if she ever finds this, my decisions weren't always right, but they were always for you. Her breath hitched, and she sank into a nearby chair, Samuel squirming slightly in her lap. She flipped through the pages, each one filled with entries detailing her father's thoughts, fears, and hopes during his partnership with James. One entry caught her attention. James doesn't see it yet, but the men we're working with are dangerous. I've found discrepancies in their financials, money that shouldn't be there, deals that don't add up. I tried to warn him today, but he's too focused on the end goal. I don't blame him. He's always been ambitious, and I admired that about him. But this time, his ambition could destroy us both. Clara's hands trembled as she continued reading. Another entry revealed even more. I stayed in the deal longer than I should have because I needed the money. Clara deserves a future, and I couldn't give that to her on my own. But now, I'm in too deep. If I back out, they'll come after me. If I stay, I risk losing everything. How do I choose between my daughter and my integrity? Tears welled in Clara's eyes as the words blurred together. Her father had been trapped, caught between protecting her and preserving his principles. And James, whether intentionally or not, had been blind to the danger. When she finally looked up, James was watching her, his expression heavy with remorse. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "Not until it was too late." "You should have," Clara shot back, her voice breaking. "He trusted you. He warned you." James nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I was young, arrogant. I thought I knew better, but I didn't. And your father paid the price." Clara clutched the notebook to her chest, her mind reeling. "He was trying to protect me," she whispered. "Everything he did, even the mistakes, was for me." James stepped closer, his tone soft but firm. "And now it's my turn to protect you, to make sure Samuel never has to face the struggles you did." Clara shook her head, the anger in her chest clashing with a glimmer of hope she didn't want to acknowledge. "I don't know if I can forgive you, James. I don't know if I'll ever be able to." "I'm not asking for forgiveness," James said. "I'm asking for a chance to prove that I can be better, that I can honor your father's legacy by doing right by you." The room fell into a tense silence. Samuel, sensing the heavy atmosphere, began to fuss. Clara rocked him gently, her thoughts a whirlwind. She wanted to hold onto her anger, to let it fuel her and keep her walls intact. But the notebook in her hands reminded her of her father's sacrifices, his belief in second chances, even for those who had wronged him. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice trembling. "This doesn't make things right, but I'll stay. For now, for Samuel." James exhaled, a faint trace of relief crossing his features. "Thank you," he said simply. Clara stood, her grip on the notebook firm. "Don't thank me yet. You have a long way to go, James." As she left the study, James sank back into his chair, the weight of the past and the present pressing heavily on him. He knew Clara's trust was fragile, and earning it would require more than words. But for the first time, he felt a sliver of hope. That redemption, however distant, was within reach. In her room, Clara sat by the window with Samuel on her lap, the notebook open before her. She read her father's words late into the night, each page bringing her closer to understanding the man he was and the choices that had shaped her life. The following morning, the mansion buzzed with quiet activity as the staff prepared for an unusual day. James had made a decision, one that felt monumental. For weeks, he had struggled to bridge the gap between himself and Clara, haunted by the weight of his past mistakes. But now, he saw a path forward. It wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way to truly honor David Langston and, perhaps, earn Clara's trust. Clara, however, remained skeptical. She had spent the night reading through her father's notebook, piecing together the fragments of his life and the choices he had made. The pain was still raw, but a new clarity emerged alongside it. Her father's unwavering love for her, even in the face of impossible odds, gave her strength. She wasn't sure what James had planned, but she knew she needed to confront him once and for all. When Clara entered the dining room that morning, James was already waiting. He stood by the large bay windows, staring out at the sprawling gardens. The sunlight cast long shadows across the room, giving it a somber yet hopeful atmosphere. Samuel, as usual, was nestled in Clara's arms, his small fingers gripping her shirt. "You wanted to see me?" Clara asked, her tone guarded. James turned, his expression serious but calm. "Yes. There's something I need to show you." Clara hesitated, her grip on Samuel tightening. "If this is another attempt to ease your guilt, don't bother." "It's not about me," James said firmly. "It's about your father. And the truth." He gestured toward the door. "Come with me." Clara followed him reluctantly, her heart pounding. They walked through the mansion's long hallways until they reached a room she hadn't seen before. It was smaller than the others, but no less grand. A large table sat in the center, covered with files, photographs, and documents. Clara's eyes widened as she realized what she was looking at. "What is all this?" she asked, stepping closer. "This," James said, his voice steady, "is everything about the deal that destroyed your father's life and mine." Clara scanned the table, her fingers brushing over the papers. There were contracts bearing her father's signature, financial statements with glaring discrepancies, and correspondence between the parties involved. But one document caught her attention, a letter from one of the former business partners. It was short, but damning. "Mr. Everett, as agreed, the funds have been rerouted through the secondary account. Langston suspects nothing, but we need to move quickly to avoid detection. Once the deal is finalized, your cut will be transferred." Clara's jaw tightened. "They were stealing from both of you," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "And they used you to do it." James nodded grimly. "I was blind to it at the time. I wanted the deal so badly that I ignored the signs. Your father saw the truth, but I didn't listen." Clara looked at him sharply. "And now, what do you plan to do with all of this?" James met her gaze, his eyes resolute. "I've reopened the case. With this evidence, I can expose the men who betrayed your father and ensure they're held accountable." The room fell silent as Clara processed his words. For years, she had carried the pain of her father's downfall, believing it to be a tragic but irreversible chapter of her life. Now, the possibility of justice loomed before her, and it was overwhelming. "Why now?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why not years ago?" "Because I was a coward," James admitted. "I let my guilt paralyze me. But meeting you, seeing what your father's sacrifices cost you, made me realize I can't run from this anymore." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. "You think this will bring him back?" "It won't." "No, it won't," James said softly, "but might give you and Samuel a chance at a better future. And it's the least I can do to honor your father's memory." Clara's grip on Samuel tightened as she struggled to find the right words. Finally, she said, "What happens if this doesn't work? If they get away with it?" "They won't," James said, his voice filled with determination. "Not this time." Over the next few days, James threw himself into the task of gathering and organizing evidence. Clara watched from the sidelines, torn between admiration and distrust. Despite her lingering doubts, she couldn't deny that James was taking real action. He contacted lawyers, investigators, and journalists, ensuring that the story would be impossible to ignore. One evening, as Clara sat in the garden with Samuel, James approached her. He looked tired but focused, his usual polished demeanor softened by the weight of his efforts. "Tomorrow, we're meeting with the legal team," James said. They believe we have a strong case. Clara nodded, her emotions swirling. And what happens after that? We fight, James replied. For your father. For you. For Samuel. Clara studied him for a long moment, searching for any hint of insincerity. But all she saw was a man trying to make amends, however imperfectly. She took a deep breath, her walls beginning to crack. If you're serious about this, she said, then I'm in. But don't think for a second that this erases the past. I wouldn't dream of it, James said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. That night, as Clara tucked Samuel into bed, she felt a strange sense of calm. The pain of her father's loss would never fully fade, but for the first time, she felt like his voice was being heard. And maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something good to come out of all the heartache. In his study, James sat alone, staring at a photograph of himself and David Langston from years ago. He traced the edges of the frame, his thoughts heavy with regret, but also with hope. For so long, he had been defined by his mistakes. Now he had a chance to redefine himself, not as a man who failed, but as one who fought to make things right. As the clock struck midnight, the mansion settled into silence once more. But this time, the quiet felt different. It wasn't the silence of avoidance or fear. It was the calm before a storm that would bring justice, redemption, and perhaps a new beginning. The day of the legal meeting dawned crisp and clear, the sunlight streaming through the mansion's tall windows as if it were heralding a fresh start. Clara stood at the edge of the garden, Samuel perched on her hip. The baby giggled as he reached for a butterfly fluttering nearby, his tiny hands swiping at the air. Clara smiled despite herself, the innocent sound of Samuel's laughter grounding her in the present. For weeks, her life had been a storm of revelations, emotions, and uncertainty. But now, as she looked at her son, she felt a flicker of hope. Behind her, James approached, his footsteps soft on the gravel path. He carried a folder tucked under one arm, his expression serious but not somber. He stopped a few feet away, hesitating before speaking. "It's time," James said, his voice steady but laced with a hint of trepidation. Clara turned to face him, adjusting Samuel in her arms. "Time for what?" "To take the first real step toward justice," James replied. He gestured toward the mansion. "The legal team is ready. All we need is your approval to move forward with the case." Clara studied him for a long moment, her emotions swirling. She had spent weeks wrestling with her distrust of James, her grief for her father, and her own fears about the future. But as she looked into James's eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected: vulnerability. He wasn't just trying to make amends. He was putting his own reputation on the line for her father's legacy. "All right," Clara said finally, her voice firm. "Let's do this." Inside the mansion, the study had been transformed into a makeshift war room. The table was covered with documents, timelines, and photographs. The legal team, 3 sharp-eyed attorneys in tailored suits, stood at the ready, their expressions a mix of professionalism and determination. James took his place at the head of the table, gesturing for Clara to sit beside him. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around Samuel's small body, but then she stepped forward and sat down. One of the lawyers, a woman with sharp features and a calm demeanor, leaned forward. "Ms. Langston," the lawyer began, "we've reviewed the evidence, and we believe we have a strong case against the parties who defrauded your father and Mr. Everett. With your permission, we'll file the suit immediately and begin proceedings." Clara nodded slowly, her throat tightening. "And what happens next?" "Next," the lawyer replied, "we make this public. The media will play a crucial role in exposing the corruption and ensuring these individuals face accountability." Clara's heart pounded. The thought of her father's name being dragged through the spotlight terrified her, but she knew it was the only way to clear his legacy. She glanced at James, who gave her an encouraging nod. "We'll do it," Clara said, her voice steady. Over the following weeks, the case gained traction. The media picked up the story, splashing headlines across newspapers and television screens. Corruption scandal exposed. The untold story of David Langston's sacrifice. Clara's father, once forgotten, became a symbol of integrity and perseverance. The outpouring of support from strangers around the country was overwhelming. Letters and messages poured in, people sharing how inspired they were by David's story. For Clara, the whirlwind of attention was bittersweet. She was proud to see her father's name cleared, but the public scrutiny was exhausting. James, however, remained a steady presence. He handled the press with a deft hand, using his influence to ensure the narrative stayed focused on David's bravery and the injustices he had faced. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in shades of gold and amber, Clara sat with James on the patio. Samuel played on a blanket nearby, his laughter carrying on the warm breeze. "I never thought I'd see this day," Clara admitted, her voice soft. "For so long, it felt like my father's story would end in silence." James sipped his drink, his gaze thoughtful. "Your father deserved better, Clara. He was a better man than I ever was. And now, the world knows it." Clara looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You've done a lot to make this happen, James. But I need to ask, why? Why risk your reputation, your resources, for this?" James set his glass down, leaning forward slightly. "Because I owed it to him, and to you. For years, I let my mistakes define me. I thought if I ignored the past, I could move forward. But meeting you and Samuel made me realize that moving forward means facing what I've done and trying to make it right." The sincerity in James's voice caught Clara off guard. She studied him, her walls slowly beginning to crumble. "And what about now? What happens after all this?" James hesitated, then said, "That depends on you. I don't want to impose on your life, Clara. But if there's any way I can continue to help you and Samuel, I'd like to." Clara looked away, her mind racing. She had spent so long guarding her heart, protecting herself and her son from disappointment. But James wasn't the same man she had met weeks ago. He had changed, or maybe he had finally shown who he truly was. "I don't know if I'll ever fully trust you," Clara admitted. "But Samuel deserves a chance to know someone who's willing to fight for what's right." James nodded, accepting her words without protest. "Then I'll keep fighting." As the weeks turned into months, the case reached its conclusion. The corrupt business partners were brought to justice, their schemes laid bare for the world to see. Clara stood in the courtroom on the final day, holding Samuel close as the judge delivered the verdict. When it was over, she felt a weight lift, a weight she hadn't realized she was still carrying. Back at the mansion, James arranged a small ceremony in the garden to honor David Langston's memory. Beneath the blooming magnolias, they unveiled a plaque inscribed with his name and the words, "A man of integrity, sacrifice, and unyielding love." Clara traced the words with her fingers, tears streaming down her face. She turned to James, who stood beside her, his expression somber but proud. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice breaking, "for everything." James shook his head. "Don't thank me. This is all for him. And for you." Clara smiled faintly, looking down at Samuel, who was reaching for the plaque. "Maybe this is the start of something new," she said softly. "For all of us." James nodded, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. A new legacy. As the sun set over the garden, bathing them in its warm glow, Clara felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like a road worth traveling. And now, I want to hear from you. Which part of this story touched your heart the most? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. And of course, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more narratives like this. Each subscription helps us continue bringing exciting stories to you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.